Hey up, Final Fantasy fans. Listen, every single one of us has that dungeon, that one miserable, tedious, controller-snapping slog that lives rent-free in our heads. So today we are ranking the most annoying dungeon in every mainline Final Fantasy game, from FF1 right through to FF16. Now, this isn't going to be a hardest dungeon list. It's not about challenge or super bosses or that post-game marathon. This is purely about frustration. A few quick rules though before we dive in. First, only the mainline games are going to count today, so no MMOs, no sequels, no spin-offs. And second, these picks are based on community sentiment. The internet is full of people reliving their trauma, along with my own personal nightmares. I'll try and throw in a few honourable mentions so nobody feels robbed of their own personal nightmares. So alright, grab a Phoenix down, mentally prepare yourself, and let's start the rankings. Final Fantasy 1. For Final Fantasy 1, nothing is more traumatic than the Marsh Cave. This dungeon is infamous for its early game cruelty. You've barely got any spells, you can't afford many healing items, and everything inside seems designed to poison, paralyse, blind, or just kill you. It's a long walk from town, so if you do wipe, which is very likely, you will lose loads of progress. The psycho demons guarding the key item hit unbelievably hard for this point in the game. Other honourable mentions include the Earth Cave, which has brutal encounter rates, and the Chaos Shrine, which is long and full of refights. But Marsh Cave is legendary because it's the first real wall Final Fantasy players ever hit, and it remains one of the most notorious endgame dungeons in RPG history. Final Fantasy 2. For Final Fantasy 2, the Mysidian Tower is the clearest choice here. It's long, it's punishing, and it basically requires you to have spent the whole game grinding magic levels just to survive the elemental floors. The enemies inside hit incredibly hard, the encounter rate is frustratingly high, and if you haven't raised your spells properly, good luck, because everything inside shrugs off physical attacks. The worst insult of all is that the final reward, Ultima, is bugged and completely useless in the NES version, meaning you go through a miserable ordeal for basically nothing. Other mentions include Pandemonium, which is an even harder final dungeon, but a little more straightforward, and Jade Passage, with its fake rooms and high danger. But Mysidian Tower wins because it's the place where FF2's levelling system reveals how unforgiving it truly is. Final Fantasy 3. Final Fantasy 3's most hated dungeon isn't really one dungeon, it's just the entire endgame gauntlet. The ancient ruins introduce splitting enemies who duplicate whenever you hit them with the wrong attack, turning simple fights into overcrowded nightmares. Then the actual final dungeon chain begins. Eureka, Crystal Tower, World of Darkness, back to back with no proper save points in the original NES version. You can lose hours of progress with a single mistake. Other mentions include the Nepto Temple, where you are forced into mini and deal 1 damage unless you've levelled your mages, and the Cave of Shadows with even more splitting enemies. But it's the final gauntlet that wins because it's one of the most punishing, high-stakes dungeon sequences in the entire franchise and famously broke thousands of childhood playthroughs. Final Fantasy 4. For Final Fantasy 4, the Magnetic or Lodestone Cavern is easily the most frustrating dungeon. The entire gimmick is that metal equipment doesn't work. Your characters literally freeze in place, so you are forced to unequip almost everything that makes your party strong. Cecil, the knight who relies on heavy armour and a shield, becomes basically useless. The enemies are tanky, they hit hard, and you're running around with weak gear or no gear at all. Other mentions include the Demon Wall Cave and the Lunar Subterrane, which is long and unforgiving, but the Magnetic Cavern wins because it actively sabotages your build and forces you to play with one hand tied behind your back. It's a dungeon where the gimmick doesn't feel clever, it just feels mean. Final Fantasy V. Next up, Final Fantasy V, And here I'm giving the crown to the Pyramid of Moor. So you've just entered World 3, one of your main party members is missing, usually your healer, and suddenly the game throws you into a dungeon full of cursed treasure, ambushes, undead horrors, and random encounters that hit like trucks. It's long, it's punishing, and the puzzles inside slow the pace down even further. Other mentions include Karnak Castle, infamous for its strict timer, and the fire-powered ship with its conveyor belts and disorienting layout. But I do have to say the Pyramid wins, because it shows up at a moment where the player is often underprepared, and its enemy design punishes you for not having a perfectly tuned team. It's a brutal checkpoint early in World 3 that immediately tells you the easy part of FF5 is over. Final Fantasy VI. For Final Fantasy VI, quite possibly the most hated dungeon is the Cultist's Tower, a place where the developers basically said, what if you couldn't use physical attacks at all? This tower forces magic-only combat, and nearly every enemy has reflect active, meaning you have to bounce spells off your own characters or rely on very specific setups. If I'm honest, it's long, it's repetitive, and the encounter rate is higher than usual. The cherry on top is the boss at the very top, who changes weaknesses constantly and then casts ultimate on death. So if you don't come in prepared with re-raise, you just lose. Honourable mentions here include Kefka's Tower, which is enormous and forces a 3-party split, Ebot's Rock with its coral feeding gimmick, and Sion's Dream with its soft lock potential. But Cultist's Tower stands above them all because it combines mechanical restriction with high difficulty in the most tedious way possible. Final Fantasy VII. Next up, Final Fantasy VII, and we have the Temple of the Ancients. This is the dungeon that most players name immediately because it's confusing, it's full of weird side paths and mini-games, and it has that infamous boulder dodging tunnel where you either get flattened or have to watch Cloud awkwardly roll out of the way like he's made of cardboard. The whole place is a maze with branching doors that lead to treasure, traps, or absolutely nowhere, and you end up fighting random battles constantly as you try to map the place in your head. Then you've got the Red Dragon and Demon's Gate. The former is a pretty typical boss, but the latter is extremely tough for this stage of the game, especially if you didn't grind or optimise your materia. Other mentions for FF7 include the Great Glacier, which is an icy maze with a fainting mechanic, and Mount Nibble's tube puzzle, where you pick the wrong chute and get dumped back at the start. But none of these come close to the Temple's combination of confusing structure, forced minigames, and mid-game brutality. Final Fantasy VIII. With Final Fantasy VIII, there is one place I always particularly dread approaching, and it's D District Prison. This is a place where the game says, what if we trap you in a giant metal cylinder, take away all your magic, take away all your gear, split up your party, slow down the pacing to a crawl, and then make you climb up and down the same floors repeatedly. It's repetitive, it's claustrophobic, it's full of filler encounters, and every floor looks exactly the same. You go down for story reasons, then you go back up to escape, and neither direction is any more fun than the other. But the crowning jewel is the FMV escape sequence, the one that looks like a cutscene, but is secretly a quick time mash with instant game over if you don't react fast enough. Other honourable mentions here include the Underwater Research Facility with its insane encounter rate, and Galbadir Garden if you tend to get lost. But D District Prison absolutely dominates the conversation because of how much time it wastes and how punishing it is for players who haven't even mastered junctioning yet. Final Fantasy IX. Moving on to Final Fantasy IX, the dungeon most fans groan about is Gizmo Luke's Grotto. It's early in the game, your party options are limited, and the enemies inside hit way harder than they have any right to at this point. The Lamias are notorious for wiping your team through charm, confusion, insta-kills, and general emotional damage. The whole dungeon feels like a difficulty spike that wasn't telegraphed at all. You are just trying to rescue Dagger, and suddenly you are fighting for your life against snake women who seem personally insulted that you walked into their cave. Other mentions include Oilevert, where magic is disabled, and this is brutal if your party is full of casters, and Ipsen's Castle, with the backwards weapon mechanic that punishes you if you didn't hoard weak gear. But Gizmaluke wins because it hits so early, it blindsides new players, and it cements itself into your memory as the game's first real, "Oh no, I'm not ready for this" moment. Final Fantasy X. For Final Fantasy X, we're picking the Bevel Cloister of Trials. This is the moment where the story ramps up into one of the most dramatic turning points in the game, and then slams to a halt because now you have to do a big sliding platform puzzle. If you've ever played FF10, you know exactly the feeling. High tension, massive revelations, betrayal in the air, and then suddenly, Tidus is stuck riding a glowing monorail-solving T-junction puzzle like a lost tourist. It's easily the most complicated of all the cloisters, with moving platforms, narrow windows to jump off, mandatory backtracking, and the classic Final Fantasy X problem: you can only hold one sphere at a time. Honourable mentions go to Macalania and honestly, just all the Cloister of Trials, depending on your patience level, but Bevel wins because of how aggressively it breaks the momentum of the story. It's the point where even fans of the puzzle say, yeah, this one's a bit much. If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and if you want early access to future videos, consider becoming a channel member. It really helps the channel out and lets me keep making deep dive Final Fantasy content for you. Final Fantasy XII. Okay, anyone familiar with my channel will know the pick I had to go with for FF12. The Great Crystal in this game is the definition of who designed this and why do they hate us so much. This place has no map, and I don't mean the map doesn't help, I mean the map literally does not exist, it's just a void. You wander through floating crystal platforms with names like A Vikari Kaboni Car, trying to pretend the directional arrows make sense when they absolutely do not. Everything looks the same, everything loops, everything connects to everything, and you never ever know if you are going the right way. Sure, honourable mention to the Pharos at Ridorana, especially Subterra, where you're collecting black orbs in dark mazes, surrounded by undead horrors. But the Great Crystal beats it for me, because it's confusing even when you are prepared. Fans have drawn their own maps, entire spreadsheets exist online, and people still get lost here. It's one of the most intimidating and disorienting dungeons in the entire franchise, and every veteran FF12 player remembers the first time they entered this place, whispered, "Where the heck am I?" and realised they wouldn't escape for hours. Final Fantasy XIII. For Final Fantasy XIII, the winner is Teijin's Tower. The moment the game finally says, "You miss open world exploration? Well, here you go then," and then hands you a giant, miserable, repetitive, vertical corridor filled with backtracking. Teijin's Tower is 10 floors of doing the same thing over and over again. Walk a bit, fight something tanky, walk a bit more, fight something even tankier, hit a switch, climb a floor, realise you need to go back down because a statue wants you to kill a random monster you already passed, and then repeat all of that until your brain starts to melt. It's the point where the linearity meme suddenly feels justified. Honourable mentions have to go to the 5th arc, which is like a 2-hour hallway of relentless battles with almost no story progression. But Teijin's Tower wins because it's basically the worst of 13's design trends condensed into one dungeon. Backtracking, padding, long fights, and a structure that's far more exhausting than it ever needed to be. By the time you reach the top, you're not thinking about the story anymore, you're just happy it's over. Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV has lots of dungeons, but none of them live in infamy quite like the Pitios Ruins. This thing isn't just annoying, it is legendary. It's a multi-hour physics platforming gauntlet in a game that wasn't designed for platforming at all. You go in thinking, cool, a new dungeon. But 10 minutes later, you're questioning your life choices as Noctis slips off every surface like he's made of butter. No enemies, no combat, just pure platforming misery for hours. It's almost like Square Enix said, what if Tomb Raider, but without any of the parts that make Tomb Raider good? One wrong jump and you're falling all the way down, losing huge chunks of progress, listening to Noctis grunt in pain as your soul leaves your body. Yes, there are some other options in Final Fantasy 15 I could have chosen, places such as the Beluve Mines, which tricks new players into wandering into a level 75 samurai at level 10 and dying instantly. But as annoying as that is, Pitios is the true king of suffering. It's the dungeon that breaks even the most devoted Final Fantasy fans. The dungeon that made people leave their consoles in sleep mode overnight. The dungeon that forces you to master movement in a game that barely has any. It is, in every possible way, FF15's most famously hated nightmare. Final Fantasy 16. For Final Fantasy 16, the most frustrating dungeon is Barnabas's castle. And honestly, it's not because it's difficult per se, it's because it just doesn't stop. This place is basically an enemy gauntlet with a roof over it. Wave after wave after wave of soldiers, cultists, beasts, more soldiers, more beasts, and by the time you're halfway through you are thinking, yeah, okay, I get it. Barnabas is edgy and loves darkness, can I go home now? It's one of those areas where the combat, which is normally fast and stylish, starts to feel a little repetitive simply because the dungeon refuses to change gears. Very little enemy variety, very little environmental detail, and very little to break up the pacing. Now, to be fair, honourable mention goes to the Ironworks, which is the opposite problem. That one is so short and so empty, it feels like someone forgot to include the actual dungeon. But between the two, Barnabas's castle wins purely because of how aggressively padded it feels. It's not bad, it's just tedious, and in a game that normally moves with such momentum, getting stuck in this endless wave fest is enough to make you want to press that skip button and pretend none of it happened. And that wraps up the most annoying dungeon in every mainline Final Fantasy game. Let me know in the comments which one ruined your childhood, or which dungeon I should fear in my next playthrough. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my recent episode covering the most frustrating RNG moments in Final Fantasy. Trust me, it pairs perfectly with this list. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.